Well, hello. Thank you again for making time for NPR News. It's such an honor to talk with you.
Thank you very much, Angela. It's a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you, and greetings to your listeners as well.
So, when we were exchanging messages, you told me to call you Madiba. And so I want to start there, and I want you to take a moment to talk about what the name Madiba means. And why do you tell people to call you that?
Okay. I think first and foremost, the very important question you probably would have asked, how do I introduce myself? Of course, my name is Siyabulela Mandela. I am the descendant of the kingdom of the Tembu people, which is geographically located in the eastern parts of Africa, particularly in the Eastern Cape province. That's where our kingdom is located. I hail from that kingdom of the Tembu people, a descendant of King Gubengcuka. And of course, I stand in the shoulders of my ancestors. That is Madiba, Sopicho, Yemyem, Ngolomsila, Zonda Zintraba, Nobazingabzonda, Gekes Benzendo. Within the Tembu kingdom, I come from the last house, which is the house of Mandela. The entire kingdom is a configuration of 5 houses. The first house is where the king comes from. And the first house, which is the house of Dalinyebo, the second one, Mtiraka, Matanzi, Mamnqanqeni, and the last house is that house of Mandela. And our responsibilities within that kingdom was to traditionally mediate conflicts between all those 4 houses within that kingdom. So when I say I am Madiba, I am actually invoking one of the spirits of my forefathers. Madiba was also one of the most prominent leaders within the Tembu kingdom, and that is my clan name. So when you ask a man, particularly in the eastern part of Africa, with South Africa to be specific, they normally refer to themselves according to their clan names. So you'll barely hear anyone calling me Siyabulela. They will either call me Madiba or any of the clan names that I go by from the Tembu kingdom. That is of critical importance. I remember, if I can divert a little bit, engaging an audience at St. John's University, and starting by that kind of introduction, and there was a normal and the usual academic way of introducing us, which is very much colonial in approach. And I ask if the audience allow me to introduce myself in a very decolonial way, and that is by locating myself in the history of my people in the African continent and in the history of my people within the Tembu kingdom. And I think that is of critical importance. And within that space, I then ask the audience to actually take a pause and recognize the kind of trauma that our fellow brothers and sisters and mothers and forefathers who went through the slave trade system, and how they were stripped of their identity and dignity and their own history in general, that they many can't even locate themselves in history on who they are, and what are the names of their ancestors, and what is their history in general, and which kingdoms do they come from. And also that is
Madiba,
very much...
that's me. I can only tell you, my name's Angela. My
Yeah.
people are from Virginia, and I can't tell you more than that.
Yeah, and that's very much, actually, it speaks into that trauma and how deep the trauma of slavery and segregation has been to our fellow brothers and sisters in the United States, that they cannot go as far as locating themselves in their own genealogy, in their own history, who they are. And that also speaks into the particularly specific reasons of why a white man decided to strip us of our own identity and dignity, so that we do not know who we are and where we come from. If, for instance, you ask many of white folks in different states, they are configured according to where they come from. Others will say, no, our ancestors come from England, or our ancestors come from the Netherlands, and so on and so forth. There's something very powerful about knowing who you are and where you come from. It helps you so that when someone tells you that you are inferior to them, you can be able to remind them that, first and foremost, I am a descendant of King Gubengcuka, and we know what King Gubengcuka did in a war against the imperialist forces in the African continent. So if you're telling me that I am nothing but a servant, then you are mistaken. I am who I am, and I stand in the shoulders of my ancestors. And this is what my ancestors have done throughout history. So that is of critical importance. When you're grounded in who you are and where you come from, it makes it easier, at least the journey a little bit lighter when you engage with the challenges ahead. Now we're dealing with issues of systemic racism, we're dealing with issues of discrimination. When others try to treat us with that inferiority complex, we are able then to call them out because we know who we are, we know where we come from, and we know who to call from when we are in need of strength. When I say I stand
Yeah.
in the shoulders of my ancestors, I know whose ancestors I'm talking about, and I know their names, and I can call them by names. And for me, it invoke a sense of strength, and then I can feel myself embraced with the blanket of wisdom that would enable me to articulate myself clearly in that particular space that I'm placed in to deliver whatever message that I'm supposed to deliver.
That is powerful. And as we talk about your ancestors, I want to talk about your great grandfather, Nelson Mandela, who died at the age of 95 in 2013, so about 10 years ago. How old were you at that time when he died?
In 2013, I remember that time I was actually in my second year in university, 2013. Yes, I was doing second
So
year in
you're
university. So roughly, I
so
think
you're
I
a
was
college
probably,
student?
yes, I was a college
Yeah,
student, probably
early
2021.
20s?
Yeah, early
Okay.
20s, yes, definitely.
So tell me about that. What was it like for you to be around him when you were growing up?
To be honest, I only recognize the significance and the contribution that Madiba has made to the history of my people and to the history of my country and the continent. Later on, when I was just in high school heading to university. Growing up, I didn't really understand the fascination around this old man. All I remember very well was during each and every Christmas on the 25th of December, he had this tradition of bringing together all children from across nearby villages to come into his house and to get Christmas presents and then some food and some entertainment. He had a very close relationship with young people. And at the time, I really didn't understand the obsession over this old man. In my view, I thought he was pretending to be Santa Claus or something like that. But it came later on to the understanding that when I read about him in high school and further in university, then I understood his contribution in our own history as a country, as in our own history as a kingdom, and the history as a continent in general. And for me, it has always been that old man who's always concerned about what people are doing and what they are studying and what they want to be. And of course, surrounded by this cloud of political leaders who I did not understand as political leaders at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only limited understanding of him. You'd remember when he was released in 11 February 1990, I was not even yet born at the time. I was only born in 1992. So growing up
Mm-hmm.
in those prime times of his administration, I was still very much a toddler at the time. And by the time I was of age to understand, he had left government probably 10 years ago. He was in political retirement and just engaging on humanitarian work. But as I studied in depth the work and his contribution in the history of the country, in the history of the continent, and the history of the kingdom, I get to understand who Madiba was and very much proud of what he has done as a leader.
Whenever I hear Nelson Mandela's name and I think of him, I think of a man who, was robbed of so much, 27 years in prison for fighting for apartheid, fighting to end apartheid, to fighting for the freedom of his people. And when you mention an old man, his youth was spent behind bars, much of it. And so for you to carry his name, do you feel a sense of urgency to use your youth to continue this work as a human rights activist and scholar?
Well, of course, it has his legacy and his history uh, has an enormous influence on the work that I'm currently doing. First and foremost, it is a sense of responsibility that as this generation, we have a collective responsibility to build upon the foundation that Mandela and his generation have created for us. For we are enjoying the limited freedoms that we are enjoying today, the access to basic human rights and access to opportunities. We're enjoying these limited freedoms that they did not enjoy at their time, freedoms that they fought for, freedoms that they went to prison for. So, from the recognition, it was on the basis of the recognition of such sacrifices that then informs the kind of work that I am currently dedicated on at this moment, to say they dedicated their lives to fight so that the generations yet to come do not have to endure the very same injustices of the apartheid regime, the very same injustices of the colonial and oppressive system. And when they achieved what they were fighting for, even though they did not holistically achieve what they were fighting for, but with the limited freedoms and the foundation that they've laid for us, we therefore have a collective responsibility to take the baton and build upon that foundation and push further the frontiers of oppression, further the frontiers of oppression, segregation, and all forms of injustices, be it speaking about discrimination or racism in general, to push forward those frontiers and recognize that there are many who died and there are many who have sacrificed for the freedoms that we are enjoying today. Therefore, our limited contribution that we can make is to build upon that foundation so that the generations yet to come do not have to endure some of the injustices that we are enduring today, so that the generations yet to come are also able to enjoy the freedoms that our forefathers have fought for, so that the history does not repeat itself. And as it seems to in the trajectory of the politics, if you observe politics on a global scale, there seems to be a tendency and a yearning for the good old days of slavery, the good old days of segregation, the good old days of discrimination and racism. So our responsibility is then to build upon that foundation and push further forward those frontiers and confront racism and segregation whenever it raises its ugly head.
And so, as you travel the world talking to young people, future leaders, is that your message to them? What is their responsibility? Is it to, as soon as you identify division, as soon as you see signs of racism, to take action, to say something and do something? What is your call to action to them?
It's quite clear and simple. Wherever Mandela's generation, and Mandela in particular, and his generation in general, they had this understanding that our freedom is not complete until all the oppressed people in the world are free. So that is why when they managed to defeat the apartheid regime in South Africa, Mandela was quoted arguing that our freedom is not complete until the freedom of people of Palestine and all the oppressed people around the world. So the fight against injustice, the fight against oppression, the fight against racism and discrimination was not only limited to South Africa, but it was one that concerns all members of the human family. So now our efforts and responsibilities are charged towards those people in different parts of the world who are experiencing the very same injustices that our forefathers experienced. That is why in each and every different stages that we find in each and every platform where we are able to engage other members of the human race, we remind them that the injustices that are currently being conducted or directed against the people of Palestine is in fact an apartheid regime as it was in South Africa. And therefore, we must do something about it as members of the human family. We are lobbying continuously, lobbying other members of the human family to say, what they've done for us in South Africa should also be done for the people of Palestine who are currently experiencing the Israeli apartheid system. So, and other forms of oppression and injustices, be it happening in the United States, or we are talking about Canada, as it pertains to the indigenous communities, we are still experiencing the remnants of the Indian Act there. And even in the United States, the indigenous communities, we are still experiencing the remnants of the Indian Act, or the remnants of the segregation system in the United States, the infringement of rights, particularly for Black people, or the skewed patterns of economic distribution, and how the states in the United States uses systematically uses law to infringe and segregate against one group by another. In this case, majority of our people in the United States, particularly people of color and Black people, are systematically targeted through the police. And you have seen with a lot of killings that are happening directed at Black people. And if you observe in your prison, the majority of the people that currently fill the prisons in the United States are Black people and people of color. And that is systematic racism. And that is something that we must speak against, and even hold our governments to account when they do not question countries such as the United States when they perpetuate such injustices against our people in the US and in different parts of the world as well. So that is our responsibility.
It is. Tell me about your time here in Minnesota. You were here in March, April of 2022, teaching a month-long course at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. How did that even come to be? And what was your class about? What were you doing here?
Well, the work that we're doing actually is one that is quite an amazing and incredible work. Well, I was invited by the is it a John Humphrey School? It's I was invited, the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict, to teach a module that focused on youth mobilization, that focused on uprisings, looking at different forms of uprising, particularly ones that are led by young people. We're looking at the call for free education for the poor in South Africa, the Arab Spring in North Africa, and the Black Lives Matter in the United States, particularly the role of the youth in driving social change within our communities. Basically, we're training and educating young people on how to resist different forms of injustice, be it one that are perpetuated by government or some institutions within our societies. So that was the work that we're doing, done under an incredible work that is being done by the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, led, of course, by Dr. Matt Armstrong. The invitation came as a result of the discussions that we have had, I think that dated as far back as 2018, when he was leading a cohort of students from St. John's and College of St. Benedict to come to South Africa on an exchange program at Nelson Mandela University. Those engagements culminated into the creation of that module, and Dr. Matt Armstrong actually committed in mobilizing resources and lobbying for the university to actually invite me to come and teach, design a module and teach that particular module at that particular university. And I think they are doing particularly an amazing work precisely because the entire staff force is made up of young people and led by someone that is well experienced, such as Dr. Matt Armstrong. And for me, it was such a wonderful experience. Of course, the work that we're doing was met with serious resistance. with particularly among the academics themselves. And I think that the university in general is a very, very wide university. Not to say anything bad about the institution itself, it's a very wide institution. And you would understand when you're operating under such an environment, it is normal to be met with resistance. I remember at the time, there were times where I was so frustrated because at first, there were forces within the institution itself that were actually resistant to the kind of the module that we're teaching to the students there. But the most difficult thing for them was the class was getting bigger and bigger in each and every week. I think we started with about 18 students and we ended to close to 40 students by the time the module ended. At that very
And
same
why is
time,
that? Was word was getting out amongst the students like, oh,
I
you need to come to this class.
I think I
What was
think
going on?
I think there's a lot of discussions that were happening, anti-racist, a very decolonial form of education that we were taking the students through, exposing them to themes and issues that they were probably not even exposed to. I have had probably, I think even 80% of the class, in fact, said to me it was their first time being taught by a black lecturer in that university, which was quite shocking for me because it's the United States and there are a lot of black people there. How is it possible that it is their first encounter to engage with a black academic? And of
So,
course,
Madiba, I'm going to pause you there,
yeah.
and I want to talk to you about Minnesota. Some things I'm
Mhm.
sure you learned during your month that you were living here. Our state is known for having so many racial disparities, very stark disparities. I just want to share some numbers with you. Folks who listen to my talk show, I talk about these topics a lot and how did we get here. But, you mentioned being surprised that these college students had never had a black instructor, a black lecturer. And what if I were to tell you that many of them, if they grew up in Minnesota, their whole education from kindergarten, elementary, high school, most of them never had a black teacher, right? Because we have such a shortage of teachers of color. Minnesota, if you look at some of our statistics here, we rank last in the nation for racial disparities in high school graduation. In 2019, 20% of Black, Latino, and Native students tested proficient in reading. In the Twin Cities, if you look at home ownership, 3/4 of white families own their homes, but only 1/3 of Black families do. And then when you look at income, household incomes, racial disparities there too. Minnesota has the second biggest income inequality gap in the nation, second only to D.C. The median Black family income is about $38,000 a year, less than half of what the median white family earns. So disparities. And so one of the questions I have, are you surprised that in 2023, here in America, and, not just Minnesota, across our nation, that we do see Black Americans and white Americans living such different lives?
Well, for me, it's quite shocking and it is surprising. One of the contributing factors to that is this. I think America has been so great in marketing itself as a model, a democratic model around the world to say, if you're looking for any system of democracy and a form of leadership, the American way of living is the way of life. And hence, everyone aspires to taste the American dream. And for us, we have been to America a number of times, and I tell them that actually, I remember even saying to someone in Minnesota that it seems as though I am in the devil's house because I was socialized and raised in a very racist environment, but the kind of racism I experienced in Minnesota was completely different. I was actually at the mother of racist, if you can put it within that context, because of how racist even the province is, and you can even sense it even in institutions of higher learning. I remember at the time there were two encounters which raised a lot of dispute with my existence within that space. I remember receiving two calls actually, one from my university back in South Africa, that we have received a call from a university in the United States that were asking to authenticate whether you have a PhD now you're called a doctor. Are you really a doctor? And the university, of course, gave them direction to say, yeah, this particular individual graduated within our institution. In fact, if you're interested in his PhD thesis, this is the link. You can download it here. And the second encounter, I received a call from the family saying we have been contacted by a member within the University of St. John's University, questioning the Nelson Mandela Foundation whether am I really a relative of the Mandela family. So that's the kind of bigotry, that's the kind of racism that they will deal with, that to an extent that for me, one of the questions I would raise to the academics there, if you are so opposed to the views that I'm advancing in class and public platforms that I'm engaging in within the university, why don't you ask such questions? Why don't you challenge my intellect and expose me if you want to expose me? Why would you go behind my back to authenticate if I have a PhD or if I'm part and parcel of the member of the Mandela family? So that kind of racism, and I don't even know what to call that one. I don't know if it's a racism, but the kind of the atmosphere that I was dealing in, I could actually tell that, you know what, I'm actually in the mother of the devils of racism I've ever experienced. I've never experienced that kind of racism in South Africa. And I was so exhausted. By the time I left Minnesota, I was so exhausted. I was saying to myself, you know what? When am I going to catch a break? Because I grew up in a racist country and I moved into another country hoping that at least I will escape that kind of racism. And you get there, you are confronted with the worst of racists in that ever lived. So for me, I'm not surprised and I'm not shocked actually to hear such statistics. But what is puzzling is how America projects itself in the world as this perfect country and this perfect nation. And yet, when you go inside, you get to understand that, in fact, we are better off than America. Just to conclude on that point, we had a public discussion, a panel of academics. I was one of those panelists in the University of St. John's. The topic, it was called Politics in the Pint. And the question was from Burna Boy. The theme came from Burna Boy's song that I think it's Burna Boy, why are these slaves owners appearing in my dollar? Something along those lines. And what was puzzling, and the question that I actually first asked when I was engaging in that panel was, it's such surprising and disappointing to hear in 2022 United States only questioning why do they have slave owners appearing in their currency. One would have thought that when the country was emerging out of segregation and out of slavery, they would have done a lot of transformation, and it's such a very traumatic and violent thing, in my perspective, to see one of former slave owners in the very same currency that you carry on a daily basis. And I even made an example of South Africa to say these are things that we dealt with on the onsets of our own freedom, to say we're dealing with our currency, we're dealing with our flag, we're dealing with our national anthem, because these soft powers are kind of things that are actually invoking that trauma and provoking that trauma, and makes us to relive the very same trauma. In fact, we even went as far as to ban the apartheid flag in South Africa. It is unconstitutional to even raise that. It is in fact a criminal offense in South Africa. But to have a country like a US that has had a democracy for probably over 100 years, but still have in their currencies the faces of slave owners, and that continues as normal, and yet there are many who were victims of such system, and when they continue to see such, they relieve such trauma, and it provokes such trauma. For me, that was quite interesting. That was quite disappointing to see an institution only discussing that in 2022.
I had to take a breath there for a moment and just process all that you shared. And again, during your time here in Minnesota, people questioned your education. They questioned your identity. They questioned I think a lot of Black Americans, particularly in the workplace, feel that. Right, that there's always this question: do you have the right to be here, to speak, to be heard? So, with that in mind, I want to talk to you about about healing and forgiveness and reconciliation. Your great-grandfather, Nelson Mandela, talked so much about forgiveness, so many powerful quotes from him about forgiveness and how it can empower us. I wrote down one of his quotes. He said when he was released from prison after 27 years of being incarcerated, Nelson Mandela said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." He also said resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. Madiba, talk to me about forgiveness and how you've seen it work in your life or what you think about it today.
Well, I think, Angela, I'm going to take a very different approach into the understanding of forgiveness. I think it's critical that we are understanding holistically insofar as the processes that led to that forgiveness in South Africa and whether we have actually forgiven. Maybe Madiba might have forgiven, but many of our people have not forgiven the injustices to the apartheid regime. There is a sense, particularly from the West, and the tendency to romanticize Nelson Mandela's legacy as this peace-loving individual and who was preaching forgiveness against everything else that stood in the way. And that is a false narrative. The forgiveness aspect comes within the context of the truth and reconciliation process. That if we can go back and investigate and analyze what went wrong in the past, and the perpetrators of such injustices during colonialism and apartheid can come forward and shed light into the injustices that happened, then maybe we can find ways in which we can heal as a nation and move forward and reconcile. And in that process of moving forward, and in that processes of reconciling, then we find forgiveness. So you cannot just forgive when there is no recognition that such injustices that happened were actually a crime against humanity. That is one thing. In South Africa, and that's what even the United Nations in the 1980s identified apartheid as a crime against humanity. Once that is identified as a crime, then we are able to identify who are the perpetrators and who are the victims of such an injustice. And how do we bring these two together and how do we reconcile them? And the reconciliation is only possible through truth telling. And once we are aware and fully aware of what happened in the past, we are able to move forward and reconcile. And then we are able to define how that reconciliation is going to go about. So the reconciliation means that we then have to bring about redress to the injustices of the past. So if, for instance, there is so in the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa, for instance, there was an amnesty committee which was all about forgiving those who have committed these injustices. And there was a committee that focused on bringing about the compensation to the victims of the injustices of the apartheid regime. So here we're talking about the transformation process. We're talking about giving the land back to the people, the land that was stolen back to the people by the white minority, then must be returned to the people so that the land and the economy can be shared among all those who live in it. And that is where the forgiveness process comes into existence. You cannot expect an individual who came and raped our mothers and foremothers and brothers and sisters, stole our land, stripped us of our own identity. Now that we've found a negotiated settlement, we can then forgive them. You cannot forgive if you have stolen, for instance, the land of my ancestors, where the bones of my ancestors have been buried. You cannot then expect me to willy-nilly forgive you because it is a democracy. You must return what you have stolen to the people, and then we have a conversation on those injustices that happened in that past. In the process of such a discussion, then we find ways to reconcile and forgive. So what the West notion and concept of forgiveness is that we had a negotiated settlement, we went to vote and we forgive one another, which is a false narrative. Nelson Mandela was in fact, a man who in the 1960s realized that violence was actually a way to respond to the government that was using violence against defenseless and unarmed people. So their own conclusion was that in the 1990s, it is time to do away with the non-violent movement, which they've learned from the likes of Martin Luther King, but to adopt a different shift, which is the use of violence as a means to bring down the apartheid regime into the negotiation table. So in our history, particularly in the West, they seem to erode that kind of history into Madiba's legacy. They seem to forget that he was, in fact, a commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the African National Congress and the military wing of the African National Congress, a man who advocated for violence, a leader that was pragmatic to understand that violence at that point in time was necessary in order to bring down the strongholds of the apartheid regime and force the government to come into the negotiation process. So when you speak of the notion of forgiveness, we must not actually erode that history, that is what the education system from the West seems to advance, that notion that you can actually do injustice to people and those people can forgive you. And that is a very false narrative. The negotiation process in South Africa was structured in such a way that when we speak of forgiveness, it is the final phase of the process. It is not the beginning. You must tell the truth, which is different to what the United States have went through. The United States, throughout its history of segregation, throughout its history of slavery, and throughout its history of violence and racism, they've never went through a process of truth and reconciliation. But yet, countries that have went through similar systems of oppression and violence have adopted a system that would enable their nations to move forward. If you look at Argentina, for instance, they had their own truth and reconciliation process. If you look at Chile, they had the similar system. If you look at Germany, they had what they call the Nuremberg trials to deal with the injustices of the Hitler regime and the injustices that were called to the Jews, the Jewish Holocaust. If you're looking at Rwanda, for instance, more recent in 1994, Rwanda went through a genocide that almost wiped out 1 million people from the Tutsis. They had to go through a process of their own truth and reconciliation process so that they can reconcile and move their own people. And similar, more recently, countries such as South Africa went through similar processes. The countries such as United States, they did not go through such process. Hence, they are so quick to talk about forgiveness without giving a context of where that forgiveness comes from. So you pardon me there, Angela,
you've
but
explained a lot. No,
I thought it's very critical to actually put it in context on where Mandela comes from with forgiveness. Yeah, bring the perspectives. Otherwise, without that, we'll be misleading our viewers and the listeners on what Nelson Mandela's legacy stands for.
And so, Madiba, as an educator now, I'm curious, how is apartheid taught and talked about in schools? So children today in South Africa, what are they learning about the history of their country, what happened, and and the history of segregation in the United States? Because you may be aware that's something we're still grappling with now, and what is taught in schools about our nation's racist past.
Well, one of the most interesting part about the education system that I went through was it recognized the history of South Africa holistically. When I did history and political science. When we started our history, we started with the pre-colonial history and went into the colonial history, and we went into the apartheid history and the resistance against apartheid and the post-apartheid history. So that is how our history is structured. It's structured in such a way that you can recognize who were the perpetrators and who were the victims throughout that history. But the most problematic thing about it is that it is actually written from the perspective of a victor, not the victim. So oftentimes, if for instance, you're looking at the colonial history, you're reading on how the Boers or the Afrikaners defeated the Zulus or defeated the Xhosas or other ethnic groups, or how the English or the colonial British colonial system actually conquered different parts of our land. So that's where it becomes problematic, is that it is taught on the stories told by the victor. So what the country is going through, and what particularly my generation we're actually advancing when we're calling for free decolonized education system. We're calling for the kind of an education system where our Black people are represented in that particular history, where in fact the books that we are reading are books that are written by Black scholars instead of white scholars. Because the kind of history that we've learned is a watered down version of our history as Black people, even though they gave us a different perspective of where we come from and different wars and different systems of oppression that we have gone through. But it is still a watered down version, because it is written by a white man for us to read. In fact, I was taught, even in my university, I was taught my own history by a white man. I never even had a Black lecturer teaching me history. It was the only time I had a teacher. It was only in high school, because I went to a Black high school. But by the time I go to university, because universities were predominantly white institutions in South Africa, and they were only designed for white people, then I had only access to white lecturers who were teaching me about my own history. So our movement for free decolonized education system for the poor was to speak directly into that, to say we need a decolonized education system. And I think it's something that even in the United States, Black people need to start questioning the representation of Black scholars in the education system in the United States, and particularly investing in Black scholars that are writing the history about Black people in the United States, instead of only listening to the victor's side and perspective of what history is.
I have found as a talk show host that, conversations about race, they can be difficult. I mean, some people, they struggle with the words. People either, can walk away with a lot of not listening's, I think, part of it. How do you describe this discomfort about talking about race, and how do we move past it and figure out how to have civil conversations that promote understanding?
So for me, I think, Angela, one thing that I have actually picked, and now that pertains to my experiences while I was a student at George Mason University. I was visiting scholar at George Mason University for about 4 months in 2018.
In Virginia.
In Virginia,
that's my home state. Yes. Did you like Virginia?
Not really. For some reason, for some reason, I went to the most racist states in the U.S. All the time I go. I keep asking what is wrong with me.
Well, wait a minute. Virginia's right outside of Washington, D.C. What happened during your month teaching in Virginia at George Mason University?
Well, at George Mason, I was actually a researcher more than a teacher. So it was during my PhD. I did four months of my PhD research in the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. And one of my experiences attending these academic discussions, particularly ones focused on issues of race identity, was precisely something that we have actually pointed into, the inability to listen to one another. And for me, one of the things that I've identified is that because in the United States, the government and even the community in general have missed an opportunity to provide space where many of these frustrations are ventilated. When you are now engaging in these academic and formal spaces, you engage in so much anger that each side cannot even listen to each other. They are actually fighting. I have never been experienced in my life, particularly an academic lecture, where people were insulting each other in that level. And these are professionals and these are academics, and the level of language that they were using and the insult that they were throwing at each other, I just concluded by saying Americans, rightfully so, Black people and white, are actually very angry people, and they are very angry at each other to a point where they can't even listen to one another. And the contributing factors to that is because the people have been so frustrated for the longest of time. And the government has failed to provide a platform where these frustrations are ventilated. In this case, going back to the point that we're arguing on the missed opportunities by the US to create their own truth and reconciliation process. I mean, Canada has started that. I think in 2013, they started their own truth and reconciliation process to discover what went wrong in their past and embark in the process of bringing about redress to the injustices that were caused by the Indian Act. The United States have not followed suit into that. What that creates is the frustration, and once such frustrations are building up, then you experience what psychologists call the displacement of frustration aggression. And that's what basically I was observing when I was listening in these academic discussions at George Mason University on how angry academics are. And these are professional individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, the layman in the street, what are the levels of anger? And how do they then ventilate or displace such anger? And that explains to a certain extent the level of violence that is within the American society. And I think processes such as the truth and reconciliation process could actually do a long way in dealing with so much anger, and actually make it even much more easier to address issues of race. If you come to South Africa, we speak about race freely. We engage with our professionals directly on race issues. Of course, we're not perfect. We're still going through a lot of challenges insofar as race relations are concerned. We still didn't have a complete transition insofar as the economy still being in the hands of the minority, and the majority still without access to their land and therefore not access to opportunities. And opportunities still are skewed, and the distribution of resources and opportunities are still skewed along color and racial lines in South Africa. But at least we are at a level where we can engage openly on issues of race. And in fact, in South Africa, racism is a criminal offense. If you are caught spewing racism, you are actually arrested and you are charged in the court of law. That's how far we have gone in South Africa. I mean, we've had numerous cases where a white woman was spewing racism. That particular individual has been held accountable and was actually arrested and fined for spewing such racism. So it has gotten to that level that because we're comfortable to engage on race relations, we have been able to create systems in place through the law to hold those who advances racism openly to account in the court of law and even be arrested for such as a criminal offense. And I don't think the United States is anywhere closer to get to that level.
Mm. So, Madiba, one of the reasons I'm talking with you today, you are aware that I'm about to board a flight to Johannesburg on Friday. I will be there for 11 days with a group of public radio listeners from around the country. Most of them are from Minnesota. What can we expect in our interactions or our conversations when we're in Johannesburg, when we're in Cape Town? What are the interactions like between whites and blacks and other people of color throughout South Africa?
First and foremost, I think South Africa is a good land to stand. One of the most beautiful countries. The people are lovely. Languages are amazing. You are going to have a lot of fun, and I can guarantee you, by the time you leave, you would want to relocate to South Africa. It is that beautiful and it is that great. And of course, if you land in cities such as Johannesburg, it's a melting pot of different cultures. People from different walks of life, particularly across the African continent, are found in cities such as Johannesburg. And it is also the economic hub of the country, to put things into perspective. So you'll find people from different walks of life. You would understand that South Africa, we have 11 official languages. So you'll hear
11?
11 official
languages?
Yes, 11 official languages. Those are official languages, including the colonial language, which is English. So you'll find people speaking different languages, and they are comfortable in who they are. And that is their identity. And that is the kind of democracy we have created, a multi-party democracy where everyone has an opportunity and a voice to contribute. But what you are also going to experience is a different perspective. There's been in the Western world, they've identified South Africa, for instance, the transition process as a miracle. And there is nothing miraculous about South Africa. We have a system that was a liberation system, a movement that was not complete. It only ended on the transfer of the political power without the transfer of the economic power. So we are still going to experience those disparities between the blacks and the whites, with the white people staying and living in more affluent areas, and the middle class of South Africa are staying in the suburbs as well, and then the poorest of the poor staying in dehumanizing conditions, in squalors, in the shacks. And you are going to see that when you go to Soweto. And when you go to Soweto, you are going to see how our people are living, and how what you're going to experience is how the post-apartheid regime, the Mandela administration and subsequent administration, tried to actually transform the lives of the people by providing social housing for the poor, in a way to redress the injustices of the apartheid system. But that is also still a continuous process, and also an incomplete process in itself. But what you are also going to experience is the differences between how Black people and white people live. In Soweto, our people live in a different kind of life. They enjoy certain opportunities and certain freedoms, but they are living in congested areas, where to such an extent that in other areas there is no access to healthcare, there is no access to sanitation, there's no access to water, there is no proper housing. And those are the
Today.
even today, those are the
Today.
realities of under which our people are living under. And of course, when you go to Cape Town, you're going to see a very sharp contrast between white people and Black people. Literally, in one side of the street, it would be affluent housing, and on the other side of the street, affluent housing where white people will reside, and some few rich Black people and privileged Black people. And on the other side of the street, you're going to see people living in squalors and dehumanizing conditions, in shacks. And that is the reality, where you can't even have an ambulance that goes into that area, where you don't even have proper electrification, no access to water, no access to sanitation, no proper education system, or even clinics, or proper healthcare. So those are the realities of Cape Town and that province called the Western Cape. You remember when the white men came, they went through Western Cape. So the concentration of white people in the country is actually in the Western Cape, and others are distributed across the country depending on where the prime land is. So what you can, in general, to conclude, what you are going to experience is a situation where, even though the country's transition from apartheid to democracy has been hailed as a miracle, actually it's not a miracle. On the ground, people are still suffering. Many are still without access to basic human rights. Many are still going through very racial systems of oppression, particularly in the Western Cape and Cape Town. You're going to see how level of racism, how white people are so racist, and in certain spaces, they would actually question whether you are supposed to be in that space. That's how even Western Cape is. And it also speaks into gentrification, and even how even white Black people are actually pushed outside of the city to provide space for white people by making prices ridiculously expensive, which makes it difficult for Black people to even access such space. So those are some of the realities of South Africa. But I would say, when you come, just come with an open mind. You'll be happy, you'll enjoy. In the midst of such challenges, we are still happy people. We still celebrate our cultures and our history as well.
Of course. And also I want to let you know, my tour group, we will be visiting Robben Island, and that is the prison where Nelson Mandela served most of his 27 years behind bars. And I'm told, and I'm really struck by this, that many of the tours are led by former political prisoners. So tell me about that, the decision to turn this facility into a museum and then a tourist attraction. Because I'm kind of torn. I'm told, like, you'll take a ferry, you'll actually see the cell where Nelson Mandela was behind bars. And I don't even know how to process that before I even get there.
Well, I think it was a very progressive political decision that the government has taken to say what they want to create of Robben Island is to create a kind of a living museum, if you can put it in that perspective. By living museum is to say we are going to employ former political prisoners to come and be the ones who actually tour guides and teaches the history of that particular space because they lived it instead of having it as a space, commercialized space without being an empty shell. But it's important to make it a living museum. And that also plays a very key role in an agenda by a country to make sure that the injustices of our past do not repeat themselves tomorrow because history has a tendency of
Mm-hmm.
repeating itself. So when we
It
have
does.
people that went through that particular system and carry that legacy and that history, it makes it even much more touching and even much more alive for us when you are there. You get to understand in depth the injustices of the human race in general, and particularly the apartheid regime, and to see apartheid, what it was, and the crime it was, so that we do not repeat what went in that particular space. So it's and also at the same time, I mean, you most likely are going to shed a tear or two when you're there, when you get to see the realities and how our people and our forefathers lived and how they're imprisoned in that space and what they had to endure in that space. It makes it even more important for you to actually visit. It actually one of that space where many visit, they come back rejuvenated and energized to continue the fight against the various forms of injustice, be it racism, discrimination, or apartheid, wherever it is implemented elsewhere in the world.
And finally, what about you? Do you have more visits to the United States planned in the next year? Will you be doing any more teaching or lecturing at colleges in the U.S.?
Well, I'm actually, I think you are coming and you are leaving on the 11th of February, correct? Going back to the
I'm
States.
leaving on February 1st.
Oh, February 1st. Okay. I'm
Hmm.
actually leaving on February 11th, and I will be in Florida for a conference there focusing on media development. It's a conference of media executives, the likes of CEOs of various media houses across the US and
Hmm.
Canada and Europe will congregate in that particular conference. We'll be dealing with issues of human rights, and the role of media in advance as a vehicle to advance an agenda for human rights. Those are some of the issues that I'll be talking about, and I'll be giving a keynote address in that particular conference. It's a DCN Summit, Digital Content Next. It will be held in Florida from the 12th up until the 15th of February. And then I'm planning to swing by um, to Washington, D.C. I have some meetings with some journalists and anchors from CNN. There's something great that is coming, a collaboration between me and some media personalities from Washington, D.C. So I'll be coming to D.C. for that as well in that month. So I'm coming back to the US, and the agenda will grow as the year progresses.
And this is this part of your work as a regional project manager at Journalists for Human Rights, or are these additional, projects that you are
Yeah.
working on personally?
Yes, I'll be representing Journalists for Human Rights in that particular conference. You'll remember Journalists for Human Rights is a Canadian international development organization that does media development and human rights advocacy work across the African continent and the Middle East, particularly focusing on unstable countries and countries going through violence,
Hmm.
violent conflicts. So I'll be there to represent the work that we are doing in the African continent and to engage possible donors and partners who have an interest in advancing media freedom in Africa and supporting journalists in advancing an agenda for human rights through media.
And Madiba, my last question for you, I often like to ask my guests as we talk about challenges, what gives you hope? What are you encouraged by right now as you think about the present and the future?
Well, for me, I find strength and hope in the sacrifices that were made by the previous generation. I always imagine and I always think that if the generation of Mandela, the generation of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Winnie Mandela, and many other heroes and heroines, if they could be able to advance their own struggle, given the limited opportunities they had in their own time, if they can be able to achieve what they have achieved, and lay the foundation for us, what would then stop us to continue that fight, given the opportunities that we have to make this even much more easier? You see at how easy it was to mobilize behind to even start the Arab Spring, and how it was started in the social media, and how we use such a platform to mobilize the entire world. And you look at the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, you look at the free education movement in South Africa. For me, those sacrifices actually informs and brings hope and strength to me to say, if they can do that, in fact, I look at it and say, actually, Nelson Mandela finished his law degree while he was in prison. Then what would stop me from getting as much degrees as possible to empower myself in order to be able to engage more effectively in the fight that we are engaged in today? Hence, it was of critical importance. And to heed the call that education is the most important tool that we can use to change the world. So I had to go through
Yes.
education before I can even become an activist, and not become an activist by virtue of coming from the lineage of the Mandela family. So to say, if this fellow can finish a degree while he was in prison, what will stop me from getting a PhD, and what will actually stop me from doing even more than what he could do, given the limited, given the challenges that he was confronted with and what his generation was confronted with. So that is the place to which I draw my strength. It is from those sacrifices. It is from that resilience. It is from that spirit to fight and move forward, regardless of whatever stones or bombs or whatever they throw at you. You keep moving forward. I think that is Martin Luther King, who then says, if you cannot walk, then crawl. And you can continue and finish that for me. But it is those
Mm-hmm.
sacrifices and that resilience that gives me hope and strength to move forward. And thank you,
Well,
Angela.
Madiba, thank you for your time. We've been talking with Dr. Siyabulela Mandela, and I look so forward to visiting your country. I hope your future visits to the U.S. are good as well. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you to your listeners for listening, and looking forward to engage with you in the future. And all the best in South Africa.